So yeah, thank you. My name is Josh Hadro. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this view. I've been having trouble deciding whether I'm more fascinated by the boats or the helicopters, but it's a lovely problem to have. So mainly, entirely, I'm here to talk about IIIF. And so I'll get started here. I think this connects to a lot of the issues that we've been talking about here today. To cover some of these issues, this is kind of the gist of what I'll talk about. It's kind of a general introduction to IIIF, but then we'll get into some of the specific connections, and then I think that'll lead into some of the conversation following this. So what is IIIF, and why do we as a community need something like it? I'm using a lot of examples and video examples of how it works. I think that's been the best way to illustrate how this stuff works, and we'll talk about what it doesn't do yet in some future work. So we'll start at the top, the highest level. What is IIIF? At its most annoying basic level, it's an initialism, right? It stands for the International Image Interoperability Framework, which is a mouthful, so that's why you hear us say IIIF. I've done this in a bunch of countries, and there are a lot of interesting ways in which that translates to different languages in different ways, but we can talk about that later. So maybe more interestingly, what actually is IIIF? This is the closest distillation that I think I've gotten to, is that it's a model for representing and annotating digital representations of objects. Put another way, it's a way of doing the thing that we've been doing for a generation or more in museums and in libraries, which is digitizing our materials and putting them up online, but doing it in a normal and consistent way, a normalized and consistent way using open standards. And when you do that, there are all sorts of beautiful benefits that accrue, not just to an individual institution, but across institutional boundaries. And one of the most important things, too, with that open standard and the openness around it is this fact that IIIF, as much as it's a technology, and I'll get into some of the details of that in just a bit, when we talk about IIIF, we're also simultaneously talking about the community that makes this possible, that built it from the ground up. It was basically, it was quite literally sketched out on a napkin at a table in California just under 10 years ago. And since then, it's grown to be a community of hundreds of institutions with billions of images online. So really grassroots and human-based effort, right? It's not a top-down technology. So they're the folks who build the APIs and implement the software, and all in service of delivering the stuff to end users. So this is a view into kind of where this is being used. This is as up-to-date as I know, but it's surely missing a lot of institutions. It's really a global effort that's taking place. So the dots in blue are the consortium members. They're literally institutions that fund the work to develop these APIs and support it. The dots in red are just other implementations, institutions that we know of that are making use of this. But it's also, right, I mean, it's dots on a map, but it's also people who come to conferences and events like this. And so this was 220 some people who went to Germany last year in June, and I believe the hottest week on record, to sit in a medieval era building with no air conditioning to listen and talk about IIIF. And so that's the community that really makes this work. And so just to give you a sense of some of the institutions, it really started on the library and the national library side, but it's really expanded a lot into the museum side of the community, archives and galleries. We're seeing it now being adopted by science and technology organizations, totally unrelated to cultural heritage. It solves a problem that's really consistent across these different places. And some of the most interesting work is coming out of the aggregators, Art Store, Wikimedia, Europeana, DPLA, who are able to leverage some of this stuff. Okay, so that's the community and how we got here. So why do we need something like this? Well, we've sort of been talking about this all day. But if we think about first principles, this is kind of where I start. This notion, I think this is probably laden in the reason that we all work in the kinds of capacities that we do. But right, that the idea that images are fundamental information carriers for cultural heritage, that this idea that The reason we preserve and then digitize and make available our own cultural heritage is so that we can contextualize the way that we represent our own histories and the way that we represent artistic impressions and other descriptions of cultures, the way that we transmit those things, the way that we look at those as artistic ambitions and ways to look into the future. All of this stuff is so powerful as means of communicating these things. And so that's great. We've done an amazing job digitizing a huge amount of stuff and putting it on the internet. But we've also created a problem for ourselves in doing that, in a well-meaning problem, but we've created a lot of silos, right? We have basically created these like really rich stacks of stuff, and then we make the users extricate themselves, kind of walk along a catwalk, on the web to the next site, dig down deep into their research materials, and then pull themselves back out again. So this is a diagrammatic view of the same thing. If you talk to technology people, they'll talk about stacks. That's what we're talking about. It's the same thing. We have data and images and then a website to display it all in. They all look exactly the same from a basic technology perspective, but they're totally disconnected from each other, right? They're just completely siloed. So IIIF is meant to be and is now implemented as a solution to that sort of problem. Okay, so that's why we need it. I think the best way to show you what IIIF is and does is to show some videos. So they're basically captures of screen interactions of these are live production examples of institutions that use IIIF in a variety of different ways, kind of starting from some of the most basic cases to some really interesting, complicated ways that you can use IIIF to present your materials to end users. So it all started with high-resolution images. Basically, with mobile devices and people on limited bandwidth networks, libraries were running into this problem where they have gigabytes of information, these enormous images, and they needed a smart way to deliver just enough to the user, right? The same way that Google Maps works. It's that idea of delivering just the section that people are looking at. So this is an early famous example from Stanford University. It's a Japanese tax map, and you're meant to quite literally stand in the center of it and be able to read the names of the locations around you. And you saw that just for scale, that guy's name is Wayne. Wayne oversaw the digitization of this object. Wayne is 6 feet tall. So this map is 2 Waynes tall by 3 Waynes wide, which is an enormous image. I mean, it's gigabytes, but it works very quickly and easily with a IIIF implementation. And from the beginning, one of the basic things is this idea of enabling scholarship. This wasn't just to satisfy IT departments. This idea of letting users and researchers be able to work with these images in smart ways. So this notion of comparing images and using IIIF tools to do this, it comes from the very roots of the technology. So this example is from the Library of Congress, is a letter from Alexander Hamilton, and this is an example of multispectral imaging, right? You being able to look at 2 different wavelengths of light that actually really helped unlock some of the underlying text that had been scratched out. So just one of many examples where multispectral imaging has really changed the way researchers are able to understand images. And so part of that normalization, if you're able to do that within an institution, it actually comes as a side benefit that you can do that across institutions. So there are a lot of examples of researchers gathering materials that are IIIF compliant just in that same way. But this is an example that I think resonates with a lot of folks. This is a medieval manuscript that quite literally had the beautiful illuminations cut out of it and sold separately to a separate institution. And so as the crow flies, these aren't radically far apart. I think they're something like 1.5 miles apart in Paris. And they've all been digitized, the illuminations and the manuscript pages. But in terms of digital objects, these might as well be in different dimensions, right? Given people's ability to find those objects, work with them. But you probably see where this is going. they were both digitized and made IIIF compliant, and then it was very straightforward for Biblissima and the Bibliothèque Nationale in France to construct this interface that reconstructs these images. The images, the assets are still held by these two separate institutions, but they're very easily reconstructed into this context where you're able to work with them as they were meant to be seen. There are capabilities that allow you to work with things like translation or transcriptions, right? OCR of a page, or translations, annotations, things like that. So there's an ability to search within those annotations and be able to connect to a specific region on a page, for example. I mentioned it just now, but annotation is a core component of this idea. So annotations can be used in thousands, more than that, different ways. This example comes from Harvard's edX course. So they found that this was the perfect way to teach cell biology, was to use a very high resolution an in-depth image and then use annotations for the different functions and the different pieces of things. I'm not a biologist, but whatever's happening in a cell, the students are able to sort of understand this in the original context, right? And in the scale of what's happening there and access. Those are all just basic annotations in IIIF. So annotations obviously also unlock all sorts of other capabilities. So this comes from the National Library of Wales, which used it to do a crowdsourcing project similar to what a lot of institutions have done. So in this example, they've asked the local community in Wales to identify who is in these photographs, right? There's a very closely connected community, and they quite literally know the people who were in these photos. But there's also a way to connect it to geography, right? To geotag the image. That's saved as an annotation in IIIF. A lot of capabilities there. This also comes from the National Library of Wales, but this is a very recent project from them, connecting to Wikidata. So this is about the notion of what's depicted in an object. So this is just an example of a drawing of Aberystwyth, which is where the National Library of Wales is. But they've basically used this annotation mechanism to connect, I think that was Aberystwyth Hill, or Constitution Hill, I think it's called, this like really famous landmark in Aberystwyth, to the Wikidata property that expresses that hill, and so that now that is linked in this IIIF manifest. So this was volunteer work as well, so this is also related to crowdsourcing. So they got people to come in and actually draw those boxes and then link these things. But there's an added piece of this, which is, I think, exciting to us, which is that it's not just useful there. So this is a tool from the North Carolina State University. And because that's all standards-based annotations, one URL is all it takes to drop that element from the National Library of Wales into this tool from North Carolina State University, which is actually built to be a guided viewer through annotations. So you take that URL and you're able to use this tool from North Carolina State to work your way through the same sets of data and still see the connections to Wikidata in this case, but it could be all sorts of examples in other cases. And so that guided notion is something that's actually come very strongly out of the museum side of the IIIF community. So that's a very data-based one that I was just describing from Aberystwyth. But this comes from a company called Cog App, which has a tool called Stories, which allows for a guided viewing mechanism for IIIF materials. So it walks a beautiful line between allowing users to dig into the depth and the fidelity of the image while still presenting them a contextual component, and then allowing them to use those arrow keys, right, to get kind of back onto the guided presentation. And there are all sorts of options that come with this sort of thing. It's not just digital either. I mean, like the digital stuff is the cool stuff that gets me jazzed and other people jazzed, but there's also a piece about just augmenting an in-person exhibition. This idea of just putting a digital version of the object right next to the physical object is a very common thing that we see. And because it's all open, it's doable with all sorts of readers and tools. So the this is the most extreme case that I know of, but the National Library of Qatar actually presents URLs to open materials in 4 different viewers, just to give researchers the viewer of their choice. These are popular IIIF viewers: Mirador, Universal Viewer, the Internet Archive Reader. And we'll see if the sound works. I'm not really diving deep on this, but IIIF now works with audio and moving image materials as well. So this is just a prototype, a proof of concept of the sorts of things that are doable now with the 3.0 version of the spec. Yeah, there we go. I won't let that full thing play, but hopefully you were able to see that's really just pulling in a YouTube video as a video asset and then using the time dimension of that video to align the musical notation piece and to highlight the musical notation. So that's an example that comes from McGill, but that kind of capability is very exciting in terms of extending it out into other sorts of institutions. Okay, so that gives you a sense of how this is being used out in the wilds. I want to do kind of just a short dive into how this stuff works, not too deep, but just to give you a sense of what actually makes this work and how it connects to some of these data questions that we're asking. It all rests on this notion, you've probably heard of it: application programming interfaces, APIs. APIs at root are just a contract between 2 parts of a system or 2 different systems. It's just an agreement that data will go out in one way and will go in another way, right? As long as it's consistent, that is the API contract. What that does, though, is that it allows you to swap in different pieces, right? So if you want to get creative and swap out your front end or swap out your back end, as long as the contract holds, right, that is very doable. So you can get really creative, swap both pieces out. As long as that middle part works, this is the sort of the power of known APIs, and so that's what IIIF is relying on. So it enables and reduces costs in a lot of ways for individual institutions, but it's really in this case of across institutions where the real utility and the power of it comes in, and that normalization mechanism that the APIs bring, it really becomes powerful. It's this idea of being able to annotate images that are coming from a variety of institutions, to be able to work with annotations that are coming from other institutions. That's really where that API example really becomes most powerful. So I won't dwell too much on this, but there are basically 2 main APIs that make IIIF work. One that drives the pixels, and one that drives kind of the presentation of the object. The image API is what delivers the pixels. What this is showing is really just that it's a URL. It's just ways of changing a URL to deliver different parts of the image or the entirety of the image in a different quality, that sort of thing. These are the transformations that I was mentioning. The presentation API takes that information and then combines it with just enough metadata and structure to drive a really useful viewing experience. So it does things like structure and properties. We're not a metadata standard. We work with all of your metadata standards. So we just carry basic stuff, right? Labels, descriptions, rights, attributions, things like that. So this is the best way to do it, is to actually look at it, right? This is a classic view of a IIIF object. So the stuff in blue is the stuff driven by the image API, the pixels themselves, and that's a deep zoomable piece right there. The parts in red, the structure, right? The order of the pieces, the metadata carried with it, that's the presentation API. And then one complication here. Those thumbnails are actually also the image API. So this is actually doing double duty down there. Hope that makes sense. And so here's an example out in the wild. So this is from the Art Institute of Chicago. This is a medical sketchbook using that exact same set of tools, the image API and the presentation API. And again, using it live to place it and juxtapose it right next to the actual physical object itself. But they also do a great job of reusing the image API tools that they have. So almost everywhere where there are thumbnails or pieces of an image, that's driven by their IIIF image API. And so that's driven by a very simple and lightweight tool that they use to give staff and other folks at the museum ways to crop and select just portions of these different images. I'm not really going to dwell on these, but if you want, we can talk later. There is a search API that allows you to search within annotations or transcriptions. And there's a lightweight notion of authentication where you can present an authentication boundary for users or a click-through, for example. The last bit I'll touch on here is what IIIF doesn't solve yet. So that's all. I think this unlocks a lot of capability at individual institutions. What we don't solve yet is how to discover these things, right, across different institutions. That's kind of a desire that a lot of folks in museums and library land have. And there are tools that IIIF can bring to the table, but it doesn't solve that yet. So we're working on some of these pieces. This is kind of the state of the art. This is our discovery community group and technical group are working on these things. Things called like a change discovery API and a content state API. One of the most important things is that we have just founded what we're calling Discovery for Humans, which is kind of to complement the technical work that's happening. It's really about user experience. So if you're interested, now is actually a great time to get involved with the Discovery for Humans group to talk through about how people will actually come to work with these objects, how they will discover them in the first place, if that makes sense. Okay, and the rest of this is kind of standard stuff. I'll just mention it quickly, but there's a ton of software tools, vendor software, open source software, all sorts of ways to get started. If you're interested, let me know, and I'm happy to point you in the right direction. You heard me say this. There's already hundreds of adopters. We believe more than 1 billion images that are compliant, and we're just on the cusp of a new phase of this, this group experiment that we're all kind of undertaking. So ways of participating is the easiest way is obviously to expose your content and to join the community, and then eventually joining the consortium, actually funding the work that we do to expand this and do all these different things and have these conversations is kind of the critical pieces here. We have a ton of communication channels, but I'll leave it there so that we have some time for the rest of this, and thank you for your time. Thank you.